Speaking of December and the holidays and such things, we will be taking a break from our presentations for December. We asked around and we realized that people's December calendars are usually pretty full, and so we'll be coming back at you in January with such topics as, I know we already covered taxes, but we're going to start with sort of bookkeeping for artists right off the beginning of the bat from the start of the year. We're going to do some marketing and promotion and digital media savvy stuff. So we'll keep you apprised, and we know how to get in touch with you. But I say, it's 6:04, so I think I'll probably get rolling with some thank yous and introductions, and that'll get us rolling right at about 6:05. Again, I'm Christian Anderson, Executive Director of Louisville Visual Art. Thank you all for being here. Also with me from LVA is Keith Waits, who is our Operations Director and sort of both the heart and soul of LVA, having served for 16 plus years with the organization and knows all things. With us today is Mary Bainbridge, and she's the Senior Grant Specialist at Spalding University, and has been working in the arts for a long time, has worked for the Speed, has worked in the theater things. Did you have you had a stint at KMAC too, if memory serves correctly? Yeah. But before we get started, I would be remiss if I didn't thank sort of our principal sponsor of this series, Brook Smith. And I also want to thank the Great Meadows Foundation for being great partners in this and being invested in sort of artist professional development and training for the greater Louisville area. So without further ado, Mary, I will hand the floor to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Christian. And thank you for letting me be part of this series. I was really excited when you reached out. And I think it's really important to be able to write a grant, especially as artists. So I'm really excited to share what I know. I have been doing grant writing or fundraising in some capacity for a little over 6 years at this point. So I did a little bit when I was with KMAC, and then at the Speed Art Museum and at Actors Theater of Louisville. So the majority of my background is writing for institutions and arts institutions, but there's a lot of crossover between that and just grant writing as an individual. There's fundamentals that apply across the board. So I'm excited to share what I know and to answer any questions that we might have at the end. So just getting started. Let's see if I can make this go to the next slide. Sorry, y'all. There we go. Okay. So just on the agenda for today, I want to talk a little bit about what grants are for anyone who's maybe never written a grant before and is not really sure where to begin or how grants work at their most basic level. And then from there, talking about how you might go about searching for funding for your project or idea or for travel or whatever it is that you're hoping to do. And then the fundamentals of writing your grant proposal, looking at project or budget development for your project, which tends to be a thing that I think gets left until the very end of the writing process and really should be, from the beginning, it's really a key component of the grant, and it's important to spend some time there. So talk about that, and then I'll leave you all with some additional resources and some free opportunities that are out there that are existing for other grant training. So on the most basic level, what is a grant? For anyone that's never really thought much about this or just really isn't sure where to begin, grants are essentially funds that are given by nonprofit organizations or by the government to fund projects. Sometimes it's operations if you're working for a nonprofit, but they can come from foundation sources and from government sources, and there are local, regional, and national funders. That's just really something that's key to sort of keep in mind. I think particularly when it comes to local funders, you have a really nice opportunity to build a relationship with that program officer, with the executive director, with a board member of the foundation. Anytime that you can do that, you can really reach out and speak to someone it will dramatically help your case. You sort of will have someone who can help you. Program officers, in my experience, are more than willing to talk to you and give you advice if you're not quite sure if your proposal is really a right fit. They will give you guidance. They'll give you guidance about how much funding to ask for. I've even experienced some cases where they'll ask you to send their proposal and they'll give you feedback before you even submit it for the final deadline. That's not always the case, but it's something to keep in mind that anytime that you have the opportunity to reach out to someone there, you absolutely should take it. And again, I just sort of want to touch on a little bit the fact that there are different types of organizations that are giving to different areas. So locally, probably a lot of you all are familiar with the Fund for the Arts and the Great Meadows Foundation. There's also the Kentucky Foundation for Women, which is giving across the state of Kentucky. And then you have things like Creative Capital that are giving nationally. So you tend to have larger dollar payouts when it comes to national foundations. They tend to give larger amounts of money, but it's also very competitive because you're competing against anyone from the entire United States instead of just anyone from your zip code. Similar with government sources, I will also just note that government sources can be really great sources of funding. They do tend to be a little bit more onerous in the reporting that's necessary. So just something to keep in mind that if you were to receive a grant through the Kentucky Arts Council, you need to be really strict in how you're spending that money and how you're tracking that spending, which you should do anyway, but you really need to do for them. So if you have a project in mind and you're thinking now, how do I even find these foundations or a government source? There are several things that you can do to stay sort of ahead of the game, which I think is really important. And I would strongly recommend signing up for listservs, like the Americans for the Arts, the Fund for the Arts in particular, I believe are still sending like weekly emails, and generally at the bottom of their email list, they will note calls for proposals that are out in the near area. If somebody's looking for a muralist, or if there's a grant opportunity that has a deadline coming up, they're really great about sharing that information. So that's a good thing just to have sort of running for you on a regular basis. If you have a specific project in mind, you can search for a funder that will be a good fit. Obviously, there are all of the foundations and government sources that I listed on the previous slide, but a place that I would direct you to is the Foundation Directory online. There's a free version of this that's also known as Candid, C-A-N-D-I-D. I'll bring that back towards the end of the presentation. But Foundation Directory Essential is a subscription version of this free online resource, and it's incredibly helpful. The free online resource has a little bit of information, but it's not, in my opinion, a great search engine. The Essential version is an excellent search engine. You can go in there, you can type in visual arts, craft, painting, sculpture, what have you, and then your location or travel, arts, any of those sorts of keywords, and it will spit back sometimes hundreds of foundation opportunities. The way that you can access this is anybody who has a library card with the Louisville Free Public Library can go to the main library branch on York Street and get access at their computers there, or you can access it at home from your home computer. You'll just have to go through a couple of steps to set up an account with them, but it's a really fantastic resource, and it's really great that you have access to it through, for free through the library. So I would strongly recommend starting there with any research. Grants.gov also has some searching or some search tools. I think probably for the most part, any individual artists are going to be looking for grants through through the National Endowment for the Arts. South Arts is a sort of subsidiary to a degree of the National Endowment for the Arts, and are funding in, I think, 6 or 7 states in the regional South. And then the Kentucky Arts Council, which is our state arts agency, is also another sort of smaller subsidiary of the National Endowment for the Arts. They get funding funneled through those organizations to then distribute to artists and organizations. So if you're doing all this research and you have now generated this list of maybe 100 or however many foundations, you'll need to then do a little bit more research to make sure that they actually fit your program and that they're funding in your area. That's a really key component of this work. I've unfortunately spent a lot of time looking for foundation support for organizations, and more times than I can count have found a foundation that seems like it's a perfect fit for the program, for the exhibition, for whatever it is, but they're only funding in New York City, or they're only funding in Montana, you know, wherever it is. So that's a key component. And oftentimes, I mean, it should tell you that when you're using that foundation directory search tool. But if not, another way to find that information is to look for a website if they have one. If they do not, you can go to guidestar.org and look at 990 tax forms. Any foundation is required to file a 990 every year. It's just their annual tax form. And within that form, they are required to list all of the grants that they've given in the past year. So that's where you can find not only where they're giving, the types of individuals or organizations that they're giving to, but also how much they're giving, which is a key component, again, because if you have a $50,000 project and this foundation is only giving $5,000 to $10,000 grants, you can still apply to them for a portion of your project, but they're not going to be able to be your only resource. And you shouldn't try to apply for $50,000 unless you speak to a program officer and they explicitly tell you to do so. So that's a really nice way to find some information. It's a little bit taxing on the eyes to look through all of those 990s, but there's really great information there. So I guess the next step in this process is, once you've found a foundation or a government resource to apply to, you need to develop your proposal. And this can happen in a number of ways. 9 times out of 10, there is a written or really now online virtual application that will have a series of questions that you need to answer about your project, about yourself. You need to develop that budget. And then all of that will be turned in to the foundation, and they will review and score and make a funding decision. And I'm gonna maybe back myself up a little bit here because another key component about just in general, when you're writing these grants, is to think about who's on the other end. With foundations, there may be a board of directors who are the ones that are reviewing the grants and making the funding decisions. There may also be a panel of experts that they've brought in. Generally, for government grants, it is a panel of people who have been assembled who have some expertise in your area. I've been a panelist for the Kentucky Arts Council in the past, and I will tell you this: if you ever have the chance to be a panelist for a granting agency, I would highly recommend it. It will help you improve your own writing dramatically. And I mean, frankly, I thought it was just a really nice experience to learn a little bit more about other artists and organizations in Kentucky. But it will give you the chance to see, if there are things that somebody else is constantly leaving out, or information that you feel like you're not getting from a proposal. It will give you the clarity to know that you need to do that for your own writing, because there may be things that you're leaving out without realizing it. But because you're so familiar with yourself and your work and your community, you don't think that, to clarify those things, whereas someone who's completely unfamiliar with you needs that additional information in order to make an informed decision and to fully understand what your project is. So that's going a little bit out of order, but just wanted to throw that in there. So I'll dig a little bit into the actual, all of these sort of different components of the grant writing process. So project description is obviously a really key component to your project or to your application. Every application will ask you in some form of another to describe your project. And this is where you want to be as clear as possible, and frankly, as concise as possible about what your project is. If you can say, you can communicate all of the important information in 2 paragraphs, write 2 paragraphs. You don't need to write 3 pages about it. Because again, the person that's reviewing your application is probably reviewing 15 or more other applications, and they don't have time to read all of that. They just want to know what it is that you're doing, who you are, what you're doing, where you're doing it, when you're doing it, and why you're doing it. You should be able to answer those key elements in the first paragraph or the first couple of paragraphs of your project description. So other things that sort of along the same lines are, what do you propose to do during the project period? What's the time frame for your project? I think that's really key and tends to be something that gets left out. And then what's the goal behind it? How will this project advance your practice or benefit your community? Another thing that you might be asked for is sort of a needs assessment. So why is this project needed? And this could be anything from why do I as an individual need this project to why does my community need this project? If I'm writing a grant to do some work with children at a school in Smoketown, Louisville, why do you want to do that project? Do those children not currently have access to the arts? If so, why not? What are the statistics? How many children do you think you might serve? All of that is something that you can include in your project description, that you should include. And I just have an example from, again, this is sort of from an organizational standpoint, but still the basic elements are the same. So I'll just read sort of the key components of this, but to sustain this relationship and reach a new group of students during the 2019-2020 school year, if your project timeframe, our arts organization, this is who's going to provide the project, respectfully requests your dollar amount, which will provide 14 new residencies at Floyd Central High School and New Albany High School. So that's what the grant will fund. It's 14 residencies at these high schools. And then in the next section, we talk a little bit about the need or the benefits to these participants. So this is something that anybody should be able to pick up and read and have a very clear understanding of what it is you plan to do with this funding should you receive it, which hopefully you will. And then here's just, again, like I said, every grant application basically will ask you for this. So I did just pull a couple of sample questions that are about project descriptions from grants that you might encounter. And sometimes they ask you to be very brief. So in 2 or 3 sentences, briefly describe how you will see your work being advanced by this fellowship. That's really difficult. That can be really difficult to pare everything down to 2 or 3 sentences. Now, I will say this was just one question. You have a whole grant application in which you can state your case further, but I think it's a really good practice to challenge yourself for every grant that you write to pull out 2 or 3 sentences and say, this is what it is that we're going to do. It will help you, it will help your grant reviewer to better understand what your project is. And it just, it gets rid of all of the extra fluff and all of the other things that are maybe not as important that you may talk about later. But it gives that really clear indication as to what it is that you want to do. And then again, so this another question from a different grant is give a detailed and clear description of your plan of activities and include how many days of travel you will take. Let us know first where you will go, when you want to go, what you want to do or see, and who you want to see or connect with. Again, it's explicitly stated the who, what, where, when. When are you going to do this? So just being as clear as possible is extremely important, because again, you're trying to communicate this to someone who's maybe reading 15 or more of these applications. So another sort of common element of any grant is to talk about the goals and outcomes. So again, this could be goals for yourself. Is this going to help you and your artistic practice down the line? Is this going to help your community? Is it going to benefit an organization? Will it maybe help a group of artists? That would be great. This is where you have the opportunity to state what your goals are. And it's key, oh, actually, I'm going to skip to the next slide. It's key when you're talking about your goals that they be SMART goals. Probably a lot of people that are on this webinar have heard this term before and have maybe even used it or seen it specifically requested in grant applications. I certainly have. But any goal that you set for a project should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Again, you want to be as specific as possible about what it is that you're hoping to do. Understanding that you don't have a crystal ball to the future, and some things may change. And if they do, again, reach out to that program officer and just let them know the situation. I have almost always, essentially gotten approval if changes needed to happen with a grant. Funders are understandable that things change. If you plan to take a trip to New York on July 1st and on June 22nd you broke your leg, they are not going to take, I think it's unlikely that they would take the funding away from you. They'll be understanding. So again, something that's measurable and achievable. You really want to make sure that you're not setting goals for yourself that you think, you really would like to be able to do that, but it maybe feels a little bit unrealistic. I would say it's much better to set yourself with smaller goals that you can then surpass, and you make sure that you're able to do what it is that you want to set out to do. Your project should be relevant. It should be relevant to yourself, to your community, to your practice, to the times. I in other grants have used an example of a project that used telehealth. So that's very relevant to the fact that we're dealing with COVID-19 and everything is happening online like this. So relevance is important, and the time-bound piece is incredibly important. Anytime you can include a timeline for your project, that will be so helpful to yourself, so that you know what it is that you want to do, and to your reviewer again. I think that's all for that slide. So the last piece that is, again, basically always included in any grant proposal is the About You section. So this is really your chance to tell your story, share who you are, talk about what inspires you, your community, where you're living. Again, thinking about who the reader is. If you're writing a grant or a project that's going to happen again in Louisville, Kentucky, and you're applying to the National Endowment for the Humanities, your reviewer may be in Washington State and have zero concept of what Louisville is, let alone specific neighborhoods within Louisville. Or even, if you're inspired by one particular artist, you should talk a little bit more about that, because your reviewer may not know who that person is. And then again, here's your chance to sort of include your artist statement. And I did, again, pulled out a few sample questions from some grants that are available to artists. So describe your artistic practice. How long have you been engaged in this artistic pursuit? What significant milestones have you reached thus far? Give a brief outline of your practice. Give some background about your artistic concerns and interests. Tell us about the traditional art form you practice. Please explain the process, materials used, and instruments and tools involved. That one was for a specific traditional art grant. So just to clarify that. So finally, when it comes to the narrative, there are some really key factors to think about with essentially the writing structure. So we've talked about all of these different elements of a sort of normal proposal, what all you might be expected to include. So I just want to talk a little bit about readability, which is really key to your application. So a rule of thumb for grant writing is to write for a 9th to 10th grade level. Admittedly, when you are, for me at least, when I'm writing, that tends to feel like that's really hard to hit, and it tends to be a little bit above that, but that's just a good rule of thumb because, not everyone, again, this is like who's going to be reviewing and scoring this application. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to read. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to read your application narrative out loud to yourself. And just today, actually, someone gave me a tip that they use, which is to read your application backwards, because that will sort of trick your mind into seeing things, especially if it's something that you've been working on for days and weeks, you will sort of know what it is that you need to say, and your brain may sort of read ahead and then miss some of the, the sort of maybe grammatical issues that might exist, or if you skipped a word or whatever it is. But if you read it backwards, you're sort of tricking your mind into not being able to read forward. So that may be another tool that you might want to use just to check your work. I also will say just writing in Word will give you your sort of readability score. I also like to use this HemingwayApp.com. You can just copy and paste your language into that. It's an online service, and it will give you the readability. It will highlight particularly difficult sentences that you may want to think about breaking up or changing some of the language around for. And we'll give you sort of an overall readability score, which is super helpful. The other thing that Hemingway app will do is call out your use of passive voice. This is something that will save you characters, because I think we've all, as much as I can harp on the fact that you should be as clear and concise as possible, I have certainly had many, many grants in which I wanted to write a lot more than the space allowed for. If you have 1,500 characters, that's not really a whole lot to actually share what it is that you want to do, which is great in many capacities and can be a real challenge in other capacities. So avoiding passive voice, if you use active voice, it will cut down on the amount of language or words or characters that you're using. It also, I think, just lends a little bit more, again, essentially activity, activeness to what it is that you're going to do. And sounds like you're very committed to what it is that you're going to do. So, for instance, I have some examples here, which you can read for yourself, but instead of saying in this format, traditional lecture courses will be delivered online, we would say professors will deliver traditional lecture courses online. That's sort of a much more active way of saying that. And we've completely eliminated several characters and by doing that. So finally, my other piece of readability advice is to avoid or define specialty language. And I didn't put it on here, but also acronyms. So if, maybe everyone on this call knows what a registrar is, but somebody, again, if you're writing to a foundation and there's a board of directors that are reviewing it, they probably don't know what a registrar is because they've never worked in a museum. So it's key to define what those words are or to avoid them where possible. And the same thing for acronyms. If you have a project name or, this is, I don't know, I'm just thinking about grants that I've written recently or helped write for psychology, where there's substance use disorder, which is, the acronym is SUD, and that was maybe used once, and then we just used SUD for the entire rest of the application. I would strongly recommend writing out substance use disorder at least once in every grant section, just to give that reminder to your reviewer, because they're not going to remember that the entire way through your application. They might, but I wouldn't expect them to. I think that's all I need to say about readability. If you have questions, again, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll address them at the end. So budgeting, and I have a very sad puppy here because I think this is how everyone feels about budgeting, particularly people in the arts, and myself included for a long time. The budget was a really challenging piece of grant writing, but I've come to really love the budget. And it's something that you should be thinking about from the very start of your proposal, even again, just to help you qualify if a funder is appropriate for your project. If you don't know how much your budget is, you may not even know what foundation to ask for, because you may think that you have a $10,000 project, but you found a funder that can maybe fund $10,000, and then you sit down and write the whole narrative, and then you get to the budget, and then suddenly you're thinking about all of the other costs that are involved, and actually your budget is $20,000. Now what are you going to do? You have to either find another funder to make up that 10,000, or change your project, which nobody wants to do. So I strongly recommend working on a budget, even if it's, it's not a final budget, it's just a template at the beginning of your writing process. When you're working on your budget, I would strongly encourage you to try to think of all of the different things that may be included in your proposal, or that, that may contribute to your project. But you also really have to make sure that your costs are reasonable and that they're relevant to your project. And they absolutely have to match your project description. I worked on a grant with some other people, and they had written a lot of the narrative, and it was sounding great, and I was really excited, and I was like, this is a perfect project for this funder. We're definitely going to get funding. I can't guarantee that. But then I looked at their budget, and there were line items for things like that had never been mentioned in the project, but in the project narrative, I mean, like, they were hoping to get funding for office furniture. And I was like, do you need to set up an office for this project? Because you never said that. And so, any funder is going to look at that and say, well, they don't really need this. Obviously, it can't be integral to the project, or they would have said something about it. So really, you should make sure that your budget always reflects what's in your narrative, and that your narrative reflects what's in your budget. And we ultimately did end up asking for funding for office furniture. There was no reason in the application guidelines that we couldn't do that. We just needed to put it in the narrative. So that's something to sort of, as you're doing your cross-checking before you actually hit submit, that is a good thing to do, is to just double check that whatever's in your budget matches your narrative. And I will say this, that oftentimes funders will start with the budget, just to give, because that again is like a pretty clear indication of what it is that you're doing. Whatever those lines are in your budget are probably pretty important pieces to your proposal. So it should be clear, and it should reflect what it is that you want to do. And it's kind of another way to just think of your budget as part of your storytelling component. I mean, grants can feel very technical and data heavy at times, but you are ultimately telling a story. And you want your funder to get excited about your project, and that will help it get funded, and your budget is part of that storytelling component. So something else that I've just learned in here, it's not always, but sometimes grants will specifically ask for a separate budget narrative. You'll have your project narrative, your budget, and your budget narrative. And this is this is a great way to tell your story. And it's a great way to qualify what those numbers are in your budget. And you should be doing this for yourself anyway. If you say, I want to travel to New York City, I don't know, I think it'll maybe cost me like $1,000. I'll just put $1,000 in there. And then you go to New York and it actually costs $2,000, or it actually costs $500, then you are in a real pickle. So you really want to make sure that you're basing your numbers on real world numbers, and that can be as easy as just Googling flights to New York. I also recommend the IRS actually has a per diem recommendation sort of calculator that you can access. You can just Google IRS per diem, and you can type in any major city, any states, and they will give you the sort of general rule of thumb for what you should expect to pay for lodging, airfare, meals, etc., at those locations. So that's a great way just to make sure that you're on the right track. And I think, again, for a government resource, if they see that you're also using government numbers to fill out your budget, that will certainly reflect well on you and on your project. I think that's all I need to say about this. But yeah, again, just sort of the breakdown of expenses, using IRS published rates, and the exact numbers of participants. That's another sort of key element, which you should be, again, saying in your project narrative, how many people you think will be doing said travel. But this is another place where you can sort of clearly restate how many people are going to be traveling and how we came up with this big number that's just going in this travel line, versus sort of having that breakdown. So the other piece is, now you've gotten the grant, you're going to need to submit a report. So it's really important to know when that report is due. Number one, you do not want to miss the report deadline, because that will not help your relationship with that funder. And it may disqualify you even from funding it again in the future. And you want to just be able to be prepared and to make sure that you will be sort of gathering all of the data that you might need to report. So generally, when you get a grant, you can ask for a copy of the report document up front, and that will help to guide you in what it is that you need to be tracking over the course of your project. You also really need to be sure that you're tracking your expenses separately, whatever is being paid for by the grant versus what you may be contributing individually. Or if you are doing really great and you have multiple funders for one project, you need to make sure that you're tracking what expenses are being charged to which grant. And this is where it can get a little bit tricky, because there are some grants that will put restrictions around what they'll fund. You may have one funder that's willing to fund one piece of the project, and another funder that's only willing to fund, art supplies specifically. So you need to make sure that when you're expensing art supplies, that expense is going towards your tracking for that grant that will only fund that piece of the project, so that it doesn't get down to the reporting time and you're going, okay, I've got all of these expenses and I don't know what to do with them. And it's something as simple as a spreadsheet and just keeping copies of your receipts, even just scanning in copies of your receipts, because oftentimes, particularly again with government sources, you're required actually to keep that documentation for something like 3 to 5 years afterwards. So scan it, put it in a file on your computer, save it to the Google Drive, whatever you want to do, just to make sure that you have that readily available. So again, just keeping notes throughout your project, including visuals. I think that's really helpful. Funders, obviously you can write a really nice narrative about what it is that you did, but a picture speaks 1,000 words. I think that's only going to help get your funder excited about what it is that you did, and will really give that very clear description about what happened over the course of your project period. So finally, I just have a few additional resources and some other things I just want to share. Number one, I say follow the rules, but also read all directions. Anytime you have a question, sometimes there are questions that have 3 questions in one question, if that makes sense. So I think we could even back up to one of the project descriptions where it said, give us this information and this information and this information. You need to give them all of those pieces of information. There may be something that it seems like it's not a big deal if you leave that out, but oftentimes funders are working from a scoring rubric and they have little check marks and there are points assigned to each piece of that question. And so if you don't answer one of those pieces, then you're just not going to get funding. or you'll just get a 0, for that amount of points. And this is, certainly happened to me, even where I had a conversation with a funder who we got funding and it was great. And in the conversation that I had where they let us know that we received funding, they were like, we were so impressed that you included a timeline with your proposal. And I said, I think it asked specifically for a timeline for the proposal. So I don't know why anyone didn't do that. So it may even frankly just be a matter of qualifying you to receive funding or not. You also want to make sure that you don't exceed page or character limits. Oftentimes nowadays, grants are happening all in the virtual world, like I said. So you may just write in your answer and it'll just stop taking your characters after you hit that character point or that character limit. And that's something also that you can check in Word. If I didn't make this clear before, I do strongly recommend doing all of your writing in Word and then copying and pasting into the online application, because again, it'll sort of help you catch any of those grammatical mistakes, any misspellings. It's easier to share with others. Strongly recommend having someone review your application for you if you can, because that will, again, sort of just give you that outside perspective. When you've been in the weeds and writing this application and you feel like you've communicated everything because you know all the information about what you want to do, it's in your head. And someone else may look at that and say, I don't understand, or what, can you tell me more about this one particular component of your project, or what's the time frame? That's incredibly helpful. Include all requested attachments. Again, oftentimes because things are happening online, you cannot even press submit if you haven't uploaded all of the attachments. And that's a key thing to think about, again, from the beginning of your writing process, because you don't want to get down to the 11th hour and you're about to hit submit and you discover that you actually need some other attachment that is going to take you another 3 hours to complete, and you have 5 minutes before this deadline, which hopefully you are not going to be in that situation anyway. But in reality, we all are there at some point or another. So make sure that you, again, when you're previewing the application, know what all those attachments are. Again, going back to the readability, I strongly recommend using section headers, using lists and graphs. If you can put everything into a bullet point list, put it in a bullet point list. Not your whole project description, but it's just really helpful, and it helps your reader, again, really clearly and quickly understand what it is that you are trying to communicate, what your project's about. It's a really useful tool, and you can even bold and italicize things. All of that will just help your reader quickly and easily understand what it is that you're trying to communicate. And then finally, I did share some online resources. So I think I mentioned Candid earlier, which is a sort of partner platform to Foundation Directory. Along with GuideStar, they sort of merged into this new entity called Candid, and they have some really great online resources. So hopefully everyone got something out of this presentation, but if you want to know more, or if you feel like you just need a sort of supplemental resources or a reminder in a year from now when you're still writing grants, there's some great sort of self-paced online learning courses where you can walk yourself through the steps, and they have little quizzes and things to help you make sure that you're retaining all of the information. Grants Plus, there's a link here for Grant Writing Essentials. And then the Center for Nonprofit Excellence. Again, this is maybe a little bit more geared towards arts organizations, but they offer a grant writing boot camp that I went through and was a huge, huge help to my grant writing. They've offered in a number of different formats, but they tend to offer sessions that dig a little deeper into some of the specific elements of grant writing. So I've just shared sort of a broad paint stroke, if you will, about grant writing. And they have some really nice sessions that will dig further into how you budget, how you come up with your your mission statement or your artist statement, how you really write that project narrative and your sort of almost like a thesis statement for your project narrative, that are very, very helpful. So I strongly recommend checking those out if you ever have the opportunity. And that's the end of my presentation. So if anybody has questions, I think we'll work through those now.
Okay, well, at this point, nobody's posted any questions, so everybody get busy.
Yep. Thank you very much, Mary. And in speaking a little bit to some of the themes that you talked to in terms of like bookkeeping and tracking for grants, I want to sort of remind people that in January or February, Glenn Barber, who did the taxes for artists, is going to come back and specifically do a whole seminar on the best and most efficient ways for artists to do bookkeeping and tracking expenses. So we'll have that in either January or February to sort of build on some of what you talked about. And I want to sort of reiterate one of the last points, having sat on both grant panels and given out grants, is follow the directions, especially for competitive grants. Grant organizations are looking for ways to eliminate folks. And so, yeah, always, follow the directions on a grant.
Yeah, I recently worked on a grant that had, it was a huge page limit. It was like 70 pages. And we realized that we were over the limit and had to work to get it down, because it says specifically in the notice of funding opportunity, if you go over, it's just not going to be scored. Like it won't even go to the panelists. And so all of, a month's work that went into that would have just gone down the drain.
The first cut is the easiest.
Yeah, just got it. Yeah.
Okay, here's a question. Are grant funds taxed? Is that something to consider when writing the budget? And should taxes be included as a line item? Also, does the artist pay themselves with the funds, and should that be included as a line item in the budget? Do you suggest a lump sum or an estimated hourly amount, or nothing at all?
I don't recommend nothing at all.
Yeah.
So this is a good question, and actually something I would I'm a little bit hesitant to answer if it's taxed. I know for arts organizations it is not taxed. Okay, Christian's saying yes, it's taxed.
It is.
Good. And yes, I would recommend putting in funding for yourself if you're going to be doing work on whatever your project is. And it sort of, I think, would vary depending on what your project is. If you want to say an hourly rate or a lump sum, if you're sort of asking for funding to teach a class, and normally someone who teaches a class gets paid $100 an hour, you can use that as justification for asking for funding for yourself. But certainly, unless it explicitly says in the directions that they will not fund salaries or direct payments, certainly you should include that in your budget, because you're doing, there's time for you to be doing work on whatever your project is. And if you have questions like that, again, that's something that you can very easily ask a program officer. They'll be pretty upfront with you.
And as for taxes, Glenn Barber's, taxes for artists class that we did in September is on our YouTube channel, and that's one that I would recommend. And that he really sort of goes into the fact that basically almost everything is taxable. So you'll be taking if you are an individual artist and you're taking in a $25,000 grant, as far as the government's concerned, that's $25,000 of income. That being said, your expenses for what it is that you do, you can deduct against that, but you will have to claim all of that as income and then deduct the expenses on the back end.
And just to remind everybody, Mary, I might suggest you might go back to that last slide in case anybody didn't get a chance to copy down those references, because I think those are terrific. But we will be posting this on the LVA YouTube channel, and we have a lot of great content on the channel. All of these artist resource series, almost all of them are available there and will be up. We haven't really discussed ever taken them down. So they're going to be available to you for quite some time. So we'll probably have this one up very, very quickly.
Yep.
Within 14 hours easily.
Yeah. There's another question, Aaron. Aaron Harris. I'm not entirely certain. The question is, what happens if you have to split funding applications and only the ARC gets approved? So I don't know that I fully understand the question. Aaron, is what you're asking is if you ask for like travel and a budget to create something and you only get the money to create the thing and maybe not travel, is that sort of
only one part?
Yeah, so partial I'm assuming this is partial funding from a grant.
Yeah, which does happen, unfortunately, pretty frequently. I think from a funder's perspective, they would rather give you some funding than nothing, because that's at least some level of support. But obviously, funders are getting, asked well beyond their capacity every year. So, I mean, ideally, that's something that you can, if you just say, well, I just have to drop that component of this project, and that's what we're going to do. Or you can search for other funding sources to fill in that gap. If it's really going to be a major project or a major problem, and you need to sort of restructure your overall project based on the amount of funding that you received, I would say generally that's okay to do, but again, you should just talk to your program officer. I mean, any of these places that you're applying to, almost always there will be either a phone number or an email, even just, attached to the award notification, someone who you can reach out to ask about that. And they may require that you resubmit sort of an updated budget based on the amount of funding that you did receive.
And Mary, there's another question now. Can you ask for funding for something like a structure or shed to house your supplies and work while the project is being done? Which kind of sounds like they're talking about like an installation maybe, or a large sculpture or something like that.
Yeah, so it's like storage space. Mm-hmm. I would say that would be fine. I would be careful when it comes to, I mean, in the world of funding, there tends to be capital grants, which are for building projects, versus a program grant. Something like that, it sounds to me like you're just looking for storage space, and that's maybe an integral piece to your project because you need to do other things and you can't have all of that stuff around. So I would say yes, it's probably okay to ask for that, but just to double check in the grant guidelines if it says anything explicitly about capital expenses. If you needed to build a shed for that could get a little bit dicey.
Well,
on the whole, I would say it's okay.
The questioners clarified that they're talking about a large sculpture. So
large sculpture, yeah, I think that's going to probably be okay. Definitely double check what the grant guidelines are, but I mean, to me, that sounds like it's an important component in being able to complete your project, is to have that space.
Okay, and there's a couple of other questions that have come in now. So from Melissa Bean, as an individual, should we send photos and or copies to the funding agency? I'm doing that, but just as a nice thing, they did not ask for a copy. I was wondering if that is a good practice so that you get looked at again for other grants in the future. I clearly need to use Hemingway app at this time of day, haha. So basically, our artists doing individual artist grants are required to do a lot of reporting on the development of the project.
Yes. So I will say, generally for any grant, there's going to be some level of reporting that's required. If you are sort of going above and beyond that and sending photos of your work to your program officer as it's happening, you will get all the gold stars. That's a really great practice. And again, something that I didn't hit on super strongly in this presentation, but really fundraising is a lot about relationship building. And so you want to get the people at that foundation excited about your work, and you want to make sure that they know you. And so sending any kind of updates throughout, like even if you don't get a response and it feels like you're just like bothering them, you're not bothering them. You're really helping them understand who you are. So yeah, I would strongly encourage sending additional photos throughout the year, even if it's not a requirement for the report.
Okay. And Lori asks, are grants only typically for projects that help community in some way, or are there grants for individual artists to develop and show their work too? I'm trying to figure out what kind of projects I'd like to get a grant. I'd do to get a grant.
Yes. Yes to both. There are a lot of project grants out there. There are also a lot of grants that are, that may be titled like artist enrichment grants or professional development grants for artists, where you can, certainly Great Meadows offers lots of travel grants. And I'm trying to think some of them specifically from South Arts. I would start there if you're looking for some individual, again, that sort of enrichment. They do like to give professional development grants to travel for a conference or to get a mentor, or to learn about some new practice. There are definitely grants out there for that.
Yeah, and I'd like to add a little bit to that too, that there's basically almost a grant for everything out there at some point. But one of the things that we find both as an agency, but also for individual artists, is that granting organizations are reliable to a certain extent, but their funding priorities can change, and some funders come online and some funders drop offline. So at any given year, we just assume that there's going to be sort of a 20% attrition rate to the places that you thought were reliable for artist grants at some point. I mean, we saw a huge shift during the pandemic to health and human services. People that were giving reliably to the arts just switched because there was a cultural need otherwise. So there is sort of a level of constantly keeping, signing up for listservs and keeping your ear to the ground for what happens, because donors and granting organizations can change their funding priorities, any given year that they want.
It's true.
Okay, well, that is all the questions.
There's one more in the Q&A. And this is from Tamisha. Are there certain types of visual arts grant requests that you notice generally get overlooked for funding? Like, you to teach a class or receive education, or particular art styles, like maybe it's painting versus sculpture versus whatever, but some that maybe people struggle with more to find funding.
I can't say that I have seen that. Certainly there are a lot of funders out there that are pretty specific to there are some that are really specific to only wanting to fund, craft arts, for instance. So you do just sort of need to look through and see what other kinds of projects they're funding, or what other kinds of artists, I guess I should say, even what their media is. I don't know that I can say specifically that there are types of projects that are harder to find funding for than others.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that is the last question that I see. Mary, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for attending. Keith, thank you for keeping it all on track as you do. Like I said, we will not be doing an R session in December, but we might be doing some sort of social thing. I'm trying to see what our workflow calendar can do. And so we'll be in touch. Look for new sessions starting in January, February. Right off the bat, we're going to be talking about bookkeeping to get you ready for tax season. If you didn't get to see the tax one, it's on our YouTube channel. That will answer some of those questions too, as grants and taxes and bookkeeping are all kind of an interdependent triad of things that we all have to do but don't love. Mary, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Brook Smith and to the Great Meadows Foundation for having us do this. So have a good night, everyone, and stay warm or cool, depending on the weather, I guess.
Since we're skipping December, happy holidays.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.